pleased to have this discussion security forum, because as we understand, the information issues are one of the keys in today's questioning about security. This event is co-organized with Kyiv Security Forum by Internews Ukraine and our initiative UkraineWorld. You can see our banner. UkraineWorld is a networking group, a communication group in which we exchange information about Ukraine regularly, but it's also a website. Also one of our production, which you can then check, which is called Taming the Hydra, How to Resist Kremlin Information Aggression. The books are there, so they're free of charge. You can check them afterwards. Why this piece of little advertising? Because basically these are topics we're going to talk about, and I'm very pleased to have very interesting guests, very interesting panelists, and we'll try to have a vivid discussion. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I work for Internews Ukraine and UkraineWorld. Very happy to have here Yevhen Tedchenko, who is a famous Ukrainian fighter against fakes and co-founder of Stop Fake and editor-in-chief of Stop Fake, one of the most famous Ukrainian initiatives against disinformation. Let me also introduce our Lithuanian colleague, who is Giedrius Sakalauskas, who represents, I would say, the Lithuanian experience in fighting against disinformation, fighting against information warfare. He represents an initiative called Respublika, but we will talk about this Lithuanian experience as well. From the United States, we have Maxim Eristani, who represents Atlantic Council. Atlantic Council, as you might know, recently also has a very interesting initiative about the checking information warfare. So we can talk about this, but mainly how our realities are seen from the other side of the Atlantic. We have two Ukrainian speakers, Alexandra Tsikhanowska from Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and one of the leading figures in a very interesting project, which is basically analyzing hybrid warfare task force, right? Which is analyzing what Russian media are saying about Europe, about the West, how they weaponize the information. And Vitaly Moroz, my colleague from Internews Ukraine, who has new media department at Internews Ukraine and heads also digital security school at Internews Ukraine. So we have a variety of panelists, and let me just go to the discussion and have a very vivid discussion, maybe involving the audience as well. Our key topic is how to balance security, information security and information freedom. And my first question will be to Yevhen. This is something we are discussing all the time in Ukraine. Information in the global world, it is basically the question of freedom. Understand that it's a basic fundamental right of
freedom of speech. That's not only come on the initial points why we created Stop Fake, because we've seen how Ukrainian information space looks unprotected, very vulnerable to hostile influences, and there was very few, if any, understanding that it's not coming as granted. You really need to invest efforts into protecting that, and in order to protect that, you really need to understand the phenomena. You really need to understand what the source of this problem is, and you really need to try to imagine how you can solve this problem and who are the stakeholders in this process. And so now, 5 years later, we already can answer most of those questions. But the problem is that the problem already moved ahead again. So we are responding all the time. We are trying to catch up with the problem. And those who created this problem, they don't have any limitations. For example, if we talk about Russia, which is really weaponized its media for hostile influences in Ukraine and in many other places, they are not limited by anything. They are not limited by freedom of speech, they are not limited by the law, they are not limited by any resources, and they have a free hand to abuse freedom of speech, to abuse democracy, and when they are caught red-handed, they can always refer and invoke freedom of speech and the clause of freedom of speech. And this creates very dangerous precedent because it limits the possibility and actually it limits the will to recognize the problem, to answer the problem, and to find the most appropriate instruments to tackle it. And also 5 years ago, we've been actively arguing that this is not uniquely Ukrainian problem. This problem would rise throughout the whole Europe, and then we've seen all those events coming in different countries supporting our line. Of Ukrainian media before elections, and what we noticed is that some of them became the echo chamber for Russian disinformation. So on one hand, Ukraine made, as a state, a number of Ukrainian websites. They became echo chamber for all those narratives Russia has been delivering for the last 5 years, and that basically sets the ground for these Ukrainian elections. So if they've been repeated, Ukraine is dysfunctional, everything is worsening, corruption is growing, economy is falling down, that's exactly sneaked into Ukrainian media, and that sets the whole background for Ukrainian elections. For example, one of those websites we analyzed, and I encourage you to go to our website to research section, did in 1 month, they did, for example, 170 articles on Poroshenko, and 130 of them were negative or extremely negative. And all stories like that. And that basically brings us to the point where they create a lot of noise, and people are listening to the noise. And they achieve their aim because the more noise people have, the less they become interested in real issues. So nobody is interested now to look into real issues and to look into real facts. And this is a huge problem because this echo chamber, this hybridity started to work both ways. So disinformation now is coming from Russia as hostile influence, is generated inside Ukraine, is willingly or unwillingly, paid or unpaid, multiplied and amplified. And it goes in all directions and leaves people very, very confused.
Thank you, Ivana. I would like to pass the floor to Maxim. Maxim, what is your like traveling between Ukraine and United States? And we understand that United States is, on the one hand, is one of the fundaments of democracy, but on the other hand, and basically very often has the hawkish style of defending democracy, but on the other hand, United States is a country where the concept of freedom of speech and expression is one of the most widespread and supported. So, from your perspective, do you think our questioning on the need of finding a balance between information freedom and information security is the right one? If it yes, how to find this balance? If it's not the right one, why?
Well, I think that personally there are views on the balance. I think, well, first of all, I am Ukrainian too, so for me it's a personal question and disinformation that affected also part of my Ukrainian family badly. And then as a person coming from Ukraine, coming from Eastern Europe, seeing what actually balance with freedom of speech can do and how it can be used as a cover-up, as a whitewashing tactic to suppress any dissenting voices, that's something we should consider very carefully. And especially so not directly comparing to advanced or consolidated democracies. What is happening there? What choices do they have on the table? However, saying that, I think that we have a lot to learn from each other. Why? Because we all know that Ukraine has been the first test ground for many disinformation tactics. In the end, those disinformation tactics were tested, calibrated, and then deployed internationally. They've been deployed when it comes to meddling with the electoral process in the US. It has been deployed all around the EU. That's why we still think at the Atlantic Council it's ultimately important to keep following case studies. Why case studies? Because basically the whole disinformation field is now a vibrant startup kind of environment, where there is no one golden rule or not golden formula how to spread or create disinformation. They experiment with so much and they evolve so much faster that anyone could imagine. That's why we believe that following case studies, specific countries or specific processes like electoral process or elections is important. And that's where you actually learn about the trends. You also learn about the impact. So for example, we have what we set up for Ukrainian elections, which is Ukraine Election Task Force. This is basically a monitoring mission trying to figure out what kind of new tactics or all tactics updated are used to meddle with the electoral process in Ukraine. We think it's important because in the end we then see the same tactics deployed abroad. We did the same with a number of elections outside, for Brazil, from Spain, and we see so many similarities and parallels. But it breaks down to the question that many of our governments and many of our societies, many of our democracies do not have sufficient infrastructure to respond to those disinformation tactics, but also what's most importantly, to kind of set up an alert system. Because you already know and you see when disinformation campaign is happening. We have sufficient information after many years and sufficient knowledge how to spot that disinformation campaign. I think it's absolutely naive to think that you can counter that effectively with people who have been affected. Speaking from personal experience of my family, if person is affected by this information, there's little you can do without targeting their the sources of their insecurities and frustration that led them to be open to this information. But in terms of governments, in terms of civil society, the infrastructure for counter disinformation is not there, and many people do not understand that it's an everyday job that demands a lot of intensive labor work, and that's where we're trying to kind of achieve and to encourage people to build that infrastructure and invest them to that infrastructure every day.
Thank you, Maxim. This is very important that both Johan and Maxim were talking about disinformation, but let us try to enlarge a little bit the scope, and I would like to ask Alexandra, you're basically studying what Russian TV channels are doing, and it's interesting, I'm following your work, it's interesting that you're studying not only disinformation, but the rhetorics, the emotions, for example, the anti-European, anti-Western emotions, the warfare emotions, like the creating this climate of war, right? So when we analyze that, we understand that it's not only about disinformation, it's not only about fakes, it is about specific discourse and working with emotions, working with polarization. Sometimes it's not really taking in fakes, it's taking facts but exaggerating them. What have you noticed, Alexandra?
Well, we most definitely have spotted a lot of things in this regard, and it's true that one of the main principles of disinformation as a phenomenon is that it doesn't necessarily have to base solely on lies, and that's what makes it dangerous. You can take one small thing and blow it out of proportion and then spin the story and add sufficient amount of lies to make it believable. This is why disinformation thrives, unfortunately. It thrives in Ukrainian society, in a lot of Western societies, and it most definitely thrives at home. I know that one of the questions we are discussing today is weaponization of information. This is a broader idea, a broader concept than disinformation itself, because unfortunately you can weaponize basically everything. And again, unfortunately, this is what Kremlin often does. So weaponization of information, as in use of information for malign political purposes, have been spotted for a very long time. But I'd like to specify that what Russia does and how it weaponizes information at home and abroad are two very different things. They pursue different goals and are conducted in different manner. For example, if we talk about what Russia does at home, because I think it is important, if we want to counter our enemy, we have to understand how this informational society works. So if we talk about what Russia does at home, we can notice that, of course, Russian government tightens their grip on the internet. We know that the absolute majority of social networks, social media, messengers can be very easily accessed by security services. We know about the law that has been passed, I think, in second reading yesterday or a day before yesterday. The law that very severely limits freedom of internet in Russia. And funnily enough, it has been dubbed as the law on sovereign internet, which is in correspondence with the rather bizarre concept of sovereign democracy. I think we have heard that one before. This is a very interesting label that Kremlin's ideologist Surkov has coined sometime before, because Russian government likes to use different labels, but not calling things for what they are, because it's a very unpretty picture. Despite these attempts to bring internet under control, back at home, television remains the main tool for weaponizing information. Three most popular Russian channels, Channel 1, Russia 1, and NTV, are all either directly or indirectly controlled by Russian government. This creates a very secure and safe environment for them to promote the information, disinformation, propaganda, and I personally like to think that all these things are very different. Use these media means to achieve the desired political ends. What are these ends? What is the final goal? I think it can be divided in two, and these two categories are very intertwined, interconnected. The first goal is to create the ultimate sense of chaos and danger outside of Russia. And specific narratives can be divided. They can be anti-Ukrainian, anti-American, anti-European, but in the end, all of them create the picture of a very dangerous, hostile, and aggressive world, and this aggression is directly aimed at Russia itself, which leads to the necessity for Russian people, as they think, to protect themselves. And how do they do that? The idea is promoted that in order to protect themselves in this very hostile international environment, they have to unite around one strong leader, we all know who can protect Russian society from all these attacks. These attacks can be, and we can see this in the respective narratives, they can be military. And the idea of NATO, which is usually equaled, interestingly enough, with the United States, NATO is usually portrayed as a main military threat for Russia. Then there is economical threats. There are various narratives on how European Union applies sanctions against Russia, and there are two main groups of messages. For example, that Russia doesn't suffer from sanctions as much as European Union itself does. And then the second very popular idea is that the West applies sanctions against Russia because it's actually afraid of Russia and defends itself this way. This is what we can tell about economy. And then, of course, and I personally think that this is maybe the most important thing, there is ideological attack. What is perceived as ideological attack? Attack on the most important core traditional values. This ultimately, as I have said, creates a very dangerous, hostile environment, completely artificially created, that is used for heavy militarization of society.
Thank you, Alexandra. Let's pass to the response side of the problem, and I would like to address Giedrius. What are, in your opinion, the possible responses? For example, the Lithuanian example is the example of the decentralized, decentralized response. For example, if we take the problem of Russian trolls, right? How do we respond to them, Giedrius?
Directly. We're fighting them. I think Lithuania is a success story fighting Kremlin's propaganda, because in Lithuania we are united. Probably you heard about phenomenon of elves, that is civic initiatives.
Lithuanian elves against Russian trolls. They really thought.
Yes, but probably I will disappoint you, because we have no Russian trolls in Lithuania. We have local idiots, and they're mostly Lithuanians. I'm not intelligence service. I have no direct evidence that they paid by Russia, but without any doubts, they are coordinated by Russia.
We have that too, basically.
And it's not only elves. We have very good military stratcom, and we have very close cooperation between civil society and state bodies. And it's quite easy in Lithuania to fight directly when the Lithuania is attacked directly by the Russian propaganda. But the Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation is getting more and more sophisticated. Like one of the last examples, so-called whole Lithuanian forest. One forest was cutted by, I don't know, it's private business, something like that, and immediately most toxic trolls became defenders of the whole Lithuanian forest. And we're following them on their groups or on their anti-Lithuanian, anti-European Union or anti-NATO groups. And they created Facebook group, and they were calling for demonstrations to defend Lithuanian forest. In this case, even they are starting kind of kind of civil war. In this case, it's really difficult because even in the families is discussion.
But this is understandable. Trolls are living in forests, so they need to protect.
Elves as well. What else?
Sorry to interrupt. Yes, continue. Go ahead.
About forests? No, I'm not finished about forests. I think that the most important thing for our democratic countries to be united in this fight. That's why last couple of years I'm traveling a lot of countries, doing very practical trainings, not theoretical discussion. Is it correct to call it hybrid war or something like that? I really don't like that academic discussions. I'm a very practical fighter against Russian propaganda and trolls. And I think we have to share our best practice and to be united. And that's it, and we will be winners.
Thank you, Gedris. Let me address Vitaly. Also, the question of information security, digital security, which is one of the field. What should be done in this field?
Thank you. I'll start with my professional interest, and it flows into our discussion. First of all, I'm quite interested into understanding what is the role of technology for today's society. And the technology has significantly evolved, and information security is on the top of discussion. And it's great that we have the basic for the discussion. We talk about human rights, because human rights is basics for all discussions. And respect to human rights is a key right for Ukraine. But we should clearly understand that protection of human rights in the real world is more or less understandable. You have violations of right, and you fight back. You identify who violates, who is offender, and you start an advocacy campaign. And it's much more complicated to deal with human rights online because the technology interrupts many things in our life, because it's not clear who is the offender. It's not clear what is the role of tech companies and how they can protect users online. Because in this classic discourse, government against civil society, where government usually is seen as those who violate human rights, it's clear whom you fight back. And in the new paradigm, you have tech companies, government, and civil society. And in information security, we should pay more and more attention what is the role of technology and how technology may be used against democracy. I think that Ukraine haven't learned lessons from United States elections, where technology were used against society because there was a huge polarization of society, since advertisements from Russia polarized very sensitive issues such as ethnicity, religion, and so on. And I think it's not, elections are not finished in Ukraine, but I think that it will be a huge point that Ukrainian elections were hacked. Were hacked by technology, and it's not, and this discussion is not just about external actors, but it's all about internal actors. Because we consider that elections and politics should be something about rational arguments, something about respect to each other in discussions. While this election shows that, elections rely on offline platforms, first of all, while entertainment relies on online platforms. And if you see on the users and ask them, what do you prefer, entertainment or rational arguments? Many users still go online to entertain. And the perception of elections in Ukraine goes from the paradigm that online used for entertainment. From this perspective, information security in Ukraine is quite vulnerable, because Ukrainian election shows that infotainment plays much more significant roles than the national debates, because in fact reality is not bright enough. It's not bright enough for many users, and if you go online you see much brighter, much attractive reality, and that is what we all need to deal, because still we rely on rational arguments. And I believe that in a couple of weeks we start researching how Ukrainian elections were hacked by use of technology. And on this point, I would say that tech giants, in some manner, they are quite naive, because they have like more or less common rules for all countries. Even so, like Facebook in Ukraine. They come to Ukraine, they talk to civil society, they ask us to alarm them on very sensitive cases, but still the algorithms of social media now are not favorable for democracy. It's much more favorable for those who may hack election, who may misuse information, and that is a big issue for the future, how to bring together all three stakeholders, tech companies, civil society and government, and work on new rules of information security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that Yevhen has a comment, but I would maybe address another question, and you can comment and maybe address my question. Just a footnote, another publication recent by Internews, UkraineWorld. We analyzed what Vkontakte is writing about. Ukrainian segment of Vkontakte about Ukrainian election. You can also check it, but two major conclusions. All candidates are bad for Ukrainian segment of Vkontakte. Mainly it's people who are reposting very pro-Russian and separatist sites. All candidates are bad, but some are not as bad as others. And the leader in this not as bad is Mr. Zelensky. So it's a food for thought. We are also now thinking of analyzing the Russian Vkontakte as a big data project. But several times we already heard one important thing, is that the tactics is to confuse the difference between external and internal, right? The enemy is not that visible. Guido said that, Vitaly said that. I remember the beautiful, and Yevhen is repeating it all the time, that we should not name Russian media as media. But when they go internally into your society and mimicrate as your media, what can be a response? One of the tactics of Russia, we can see it, for example, with the recent, I think it was early March, recent statements of Mr. Gerasimov, the chief of staff. Basically, one of the tactics is to use the internal opposition. And I think this is something that is going on everywhere. They see Gilets jaunes in France. In France, they use it as an opposition. Even if Zelensky initially is not a Russian project, it is clear now that they will use it, and they are already supporting it. So, how to do with that? How to differentiate between real external enemy and internal collaborators? You have.
So, my point would be, I would agree with Vitaly that these days it's really very, very easy to hijack elections, referendums, any other instruments of democratic process through instrumentalization of it. And of course, those technologies are not new. For example, back in 1990s here in Kyiv, we had Russian so-called political technologists, as they call themselves. And one of the journalists from the floor asked, what is your technology, kind of novelty you use? And he said, you know, recently we were helping with governmental elections somewhere in Siberia, and you know, one of the candidates was hit by the truck, you know. So it was the end of the 1990s, and that was official instrument how you can change elections. And of course now the instruments would be very, very different because you can do that by just using technologies. You don't need actual kind of killing of the candidate because you can just talk so much about all those things that electors, voters would become so tired of all this noise that they would just skip the whole process looking into the essence of what is going on. And we've always been saying that there are kind of 4 pillars for limiting the influence of disinformation. So, number one is audiences themselves. So if audiences would not be differentiating things for themselves and sorting it out, we would not be able to help them and do their homework. Another important pillar is media and tech companies, which is also because they really became the huge pipelines for disinformation, again, knowingly or not knowingly. Then civil society, which can play, as we can see from Ukrainian example, both positive or negative role, setting up more cliches and bringing more uncertainty. And then finally, so I already mentioned users, media, tech companies, and civil society. Yeah, so all those elements are important to understand how disinformation actually is disseminated and how it can be stopped. And the most crucial typology now probably would be what you already mentioned. What is domestic and what is external? And I would just give you a very short quote what some foreign experts and journalists are saying about correlation between that within Ukrainian electoral context. I think most of the disinformation that we can confirm was actually distributed by the campaigns themselves and by domestic Ukrainian actors for political purposes. And that's just not true because Russian disinformation was providing value for all those talking points for the last 5 years at least. And they already became the part of the national discourse. And they were just picked up at the very latest moment before elections. And if we talk about what campaigns and those who informally support campaigns produce, they became active only between the first and second round as kind of the peak of the activity. Before that, most disinformation was coming in the most conventional ways through Russian disinformation, again amplified through Ukrainian legit media. And also probably Maxim would confirm, because we do this project on electoral task force together, we have collected so many examples when disinformation is really coming from Russian sources. And those narratives were first implemented by Russian media, and then they start living their own life within Ukrainian media and political context. So those who are arguing that there is no any Russian influence on Ukrainian elections, it just domestically produced noise and chaos, they're absolutely kind of leading us into the opposite direction from understanding what was a very starting point in this landslide actually drawback and fallen to where we are now, basically when elections stopped being elections, so people are not looking anymore into the real issues, they are not interested in real candidates. So that's what we would call the hacking of the process by machines, by fake narratives, fake approaches, and that make actually democracy absolutely irrelevant. And there is very few understanding actually how you can tackle that, because tackling that you might jeopardize democracy, but democracy is just a list of separate freedoms, and if you don't have those freedoms and you cannot enjoy them, the democracy does not exist. So this is a big question over here.
Maxime, and again, my question, maybe you will respond, maybe you will just comment on that. One of the biggest Russian narratives that we check everywhere and all the time is that Ukraine is a failed state. That Ukraine is a state for all four is not existing, or there is a concept, бывшая Украина, former Ukraine. And it's a very tricky thing, because, I mean, I think the Zelensky phenomenon is a product of this conviction of many people that Ukraine is a failed state. So, when did it appear? It's a very important question. But another, even more important question is that basically it's continuation of the critical approach. For example, you take a journalist, a critical journalist, an investigative journalist who says that Ukrainian institutions are corrupt, that are not functioning, etc. And where is this line when he or she gets from a true profession of a good journalist into about Ukraine, about the country?
Narrative, promoting, agenda next to journalism, and the job of journalism is telling truth, and job of journalism is exposing facts. And if you don't like these facts, it doesn't mean that journalists, every time that those people, and we all know those people, including back in America, who use this term all the time. Why? Because they want to delegitimize the work of journalism, in a way placing fake news together and using it as a concept, and then you basically degrade the work of journalism in general. But however, I think I don't want to take a higher moral ground here. The disinformation problem is so severe that we're all affected. You know, I cannot say that, for example, for my social media accounts, I've never accidentally shared disinformation. No, I did it. You know, we work on the same project trying to expose foreign interference with Ukrainian elections, but you also share sometimes disinformation messages on your account on Twitter. Like a couple of days, for example, one of disinformation messages that was produced by one of the Ukrainian election campaigns. So I think that the problem is that we don't see is that I think have all the experience, everything that is happening outside these walls and this bubble, the 70% of Ukrainian voters that are reportedly going to go and vote for one of the candidates. I don't think that we should vilify those voters, saying that by default they're kind of victims of disinformation. Moreover, this is the biggest lesson that we've learned through our disinformation work, through my disinformation work. That's the problem that starts there. For example, one of the results of Ukraine Election Task Force is also a poll that we did among Ukrainians, figuring out what the percentage of voters voted based on disinformation or believed Russian disinformation. In our results, it was just 4%. It doesn't mean that disinformation does not affect them. It means that it starts at the core of people being more frustrated, people being angry, and people being angry at the system or at the process in their countries. This is the biggest language biggest lessons that we learn here. Because if we don't address those grievances that voters have in Ukraine, in Hungary, in the United States, in the Spain, there's going to be more and more people who are voting not logically but emotionally. But you don't start with vilifying them for that, because then you create an even bigger problem, and you will have more and more anti-establishment waves. Because in my personal and professional experience, in nine times out of 10, a person who is affected by disinformation, a person who is affected by lies, organized lies, that's not a person who was tricked, that's not a person who is stupid, that was a choice. And when people make that choice, believe in something that is not true, it is because of more fundamental reasons that are driven to this choice. And those reasons need to be addressed. In case of Ukraine, reasons with corruption, reasons with lack of reforms. That is something that drives people to those negative narratives, or drives people to accept kind of reality. But vilifying this, vilifying them, vilifying candidates, using disinformation as a cover-up for witch hunting in between candidates, this is the exact same reason that led us to have those catastrophic political events in the US, in the EU, in many other parts of the world.
I totally agree, Maxim. I totally agree, but vilifying voters, no. But the question is also maybe to Ivan and to others. We understand that, for example, there are facts. For example, there is increase of prices, of gas prices. It's a fact. It's not a disinformation. But then you have media who are maybe linked to Russian sources who are saying only that. This is what I mean by selection, a selective approach to facts. What do we do then? Are we vilifying them or not? Should we vilify? And should we consider them as risks for Ukrainian security, information security?
Why talk not domestic politics? But haven't you said just right now, assuming that voters who go for the Zelensky are somehow affected by disinformation?
Sorry, again?
Yeah, you said that voters who vote for Zelensky are somehow affected by disinformation.
No, I didn't say that. That's a clash between moderator and speaker. That's okay. I said that Russians will. We don't know whether Zelensky is a Russian product or not, but the Russians will jump up, and they're jumping up. That's all. That's the thing I said.
The patronizing approach towards people who are affected by disinformation, calling them idiots, or calling people who are your useful idiots or whatever. That's a part of the reason.
I agree fully.
It's part of this mess we're in. Of course, yeah. And we're not addressing, but that was a good point in terms of journalism. Like me coming back to that. Journalism is the only response. Yes, we need to build that infrastructure because we need to know how organized this information works. But it's proliferating so fastly that even people who are against, for example, Russia or Russian enemies or those who publicly against Putin use the same book. They use the same textbook to create their disinformation campaign. We've seen that in Ukraine as well. So the problem is probably not who is per se behind that, or there is one country, one person behind all disinformation text, is that they use lack of information, lack of trusted sources, lack of journalists. There is no coincidence that the countries that are affected by disinformation the most, the United States, Ukraine, have the biggest deficit when it comes to independent journalists. There is no coincidence there. And addressing that gap is probably the first step towards getting out of this mess.
I fully agree with Maxime about not vilifying voters. This is what I'm saying in the past days on Facebook all the time, that this is a part of this polarizing strategy. But that's another topic. Ivan?
Yeah, just answering very shortly. So from where is this hollowness of and shallowness of political process, not only in Ukraine, by the way, but everywhere comes from frustration of people because they cannot handle that much information. And unfortunately, you said that media can be the only response to that. Unfortunately, only responsible media can be the answer to that. And that what is not always happening. The media are pretty much on the same page in crisis as political elites, as many other parts of our society. I mean, again, in a larger sense, I'm not talking only about Ukraine. And media are also quite behind in the process of understanding where we are now and what to do. Because media now are operating from the point of view of 1950s and 1960s, when people had two newspapers competing between each other, and they could choose their trust in the Washington Post or the New York Times, and that was pretty much what was basically disturbing them. These days, the system of media consumption is changed completely, and very often, when people are expecting to consume something from media, they actually consuming something from those who pretend to be media. Very often we see that the real media also cannot find the right place in this ecosystem for themselves because people are not relying on them to know about the news, because news are bombarding them from all the directions, and people don't care where they get those news. They would be happy to share it without even reading, not even mentioning is it the reputable media outlet, a reputable journalist or not. They just would quickly consume it. And that's, again, this is a reality. Of course, we cannot judge people for that because, again, they have the volume of information which is absolutely exceeding their possibility to digest. Then we also see, if we analyze Ukrainian elections and coverage of Ukraine, we can find that very often it's very biased, not only from Russian disinformation, but also from Western journalists. We see a lot of what Volodya called selectivity in their approaches, and their confirmation bias in many issues, because they already believe in something. And just yesterday, I had a conversation on Twitter with one of the correspondents who said, why you pause it? How many times you've been traveling to the east of Ukraine, like, accusing me that he knows east of Ukraine much better than I know it, and that sounds weird, and I asked, why are you asking that? And he said, because, for example, I'm from London, and I don't know anything about Northern England. And I said, okay, I don't know anything about Northern England as well, but I'm not giving advice to British people how to handle Brexit, for example. And he said, no, it's crazy, because you would know better what to do, what British people need to do compared to myself. And I said, how it can be, I'm not a part of the Brexit, I'm not a part of your political and media culture.
Yevhen, I'm sure you know. I'm sure you're so wise that you know how to do with Brexit.
Yeah, of course I have my advice on anything, but probably I would not just push it here on the audience. So this is definitely the crisis of journalism, because journalists self-appointed themselves very often to be the final judges of what is right and what is wrong, and why I'm wrong, why I cannot tweet something, why my organization cannot tweet something. We've never been hiding that. Our organization stays on etatist position that security and physical survival of Ukraine is a main priority. So if Ukraine would survive as an independent state, we would fully enjoy freedom of speech, immunity from disinformation and other things, because we would be the only Ukrainians who would be decided what is right and what is wrong for us. So this is absolutely sovereign approach.
Can I?
That the people who are behind disinformation.
Maxim, Mike, take a mic first.
We don't hear you.
Doesn't scare you that journalists, the people who are behind disinformation campaigns, are the same people that always vilify and blame media for everything?
The key word here would be people, because all the people are real people, they are humans, and I think none of us can say that I know the better what all others need to do, and be more adjustable to the system, and be more flexible in understanding, and at least not understand that my vision is the only vision which everybody should share and enjoy.
Guys, let me, Max, let me kindly interrupt into your tea talk and involve others. I think the key question is to how to have objective information about what is real media, following standards, and what is not. And my personal opinion is that without a change of international environment and thinking about trustworthy international organizations who would develop a kind of a very good analytical approach and say, look, this media more systematically provides manipulation than the other, I think we will not find a way out. But let me ask three other panelists. On the response side, what is your vision on the response side? How to respond to all the problems we discussed, for example?
Well, if I may, it has certainly been a very heated discussion on the core principles of journalism, and I'd like to interject with some analytics regarding elections, because my esteemed colleagues have started talking about elections, and I'd like to share what we have spotted on Russian television, and less so, but also on Russian social media. We have started talking about the presidential frontrunner, Mr. Zelensky, and Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group has conducted a short research on the portrayal of presidential candidates in Russian media. And we have to say that overall, Mr. Zelensky is in considerably good graces in Russian media, if you can call it media. When it comes to the favorites, I guess the only one who could compete would be obviously Yuri Boyko, who is openly pro-Russian candidate. Now, it's obviously no surprise that Russian media actively supports Yuri Boyko's candidacy. But there is a trick here. We know that in the first round of elections, he received approximately 9% of votes, and
12.
12.
Yeah, about 12.
Well, nevertheless, Russian media have severely overreported the voting numbers he received. There was a very popular messaging that he was actually competing for the second place and that he was quite successful about that too. And this overreporting is very interesting for us for several reasons. First of all, claiming that Ukrainians are actually strongly voting for an openly pro-Russian candidate assists Kremlin in underlining the idea that it's actually authoritarian far-right government that they strongly oppose oppresses the people who are completely against the governmental policies and who actually want peace with Russia, who actually want normalizing relations with Russia. And they push this narrative in many, many ways, including overreporting Boyko's numbers. And this is important for one more reason, because it's a pretext for claiming that elections were completely rigged. Because rigged voting was one of the main messages that Russian media pushed regarding Ukrainian elections. We've done not only the portrayal of candidates, but the research on the overall narratives, and the majority of them were aimed at completely discrediting electoral process and electoral system in Ukraine. So in the end, they could say that whoever wins, it doesn't matter because the elections were allegedly not fair. And the main ideas here were that voting was rigged, and of course we had some problems, we have to recognize that, but the scale was completely out of proportion. And then there was the idea about massive social tensions. I found it ridiculous, it was entertaining and sad at the same time, how heavily Russian media discussed Ukrainian elections being held at gunpoint. It immediately reminded me about the so-called referendum in Crimea, which has actually happened at gunpoint, and then listening to them saying that our elections, which were held in a relatively calm atmosphere, were held at gunpoint. Well, this was just ridiculous.
Thank you, Alexandra. I would just like to give floor for brief remarks to Vitaly and Gedrius. Gedrius, my question to you is, when you analyze these trolls who love Lithuanian forests, do you see a system behind it? I mean, for example, do you see that these trolls are republishing some sort of, messages or media which is produced in Russian?
The answer is yes. But I would like to, what was discussion about journalists, how they are, about influence of journalists. I think it's no longer. We have social media. And this is finally the journalists know that they have not monopoly of truth. And I do believe in power of the civil society. I do believe that the civic activists can influence the situation and and to go into the discussion with the journalists if they're doing negative things. Of course, the bad news sells. That's very pretty clear. But why not to discuss with them? Like one example, a Lithuanian made portal, news portal, half a year ago, did published article that nearby Moscow was killed Russian businessman. What sense to publish that articles? And I did like post. If you need that bad news, why not to put that was like Spanish journal, Spanish businessman was beaten nearby Madrid. why are we still looking what doing Kala Pugacheva or Kirkorov? Just switch to the Europe, and then we can discuss, and then they stop to publish stupid articles about what the happening stupid things in Russia. And I think everything in our hands. In Lithuania, that if you are not on the Facebook, you do not exist, and we can use it or their chances.
Thank you, Vitaly.
On the side of responses, first of all, we should definitely understand that media, classical media, produce probably not more information than social media or user-generated content. But still, journalism is extremely important because it shows like the priorities, it shows like the quality. But in Ukraine, we also have like the media. Which is not clear what is their funding, and we push as Internews Ukraine for more transparency in funding of media, and like the principle of follow the money, and this is like big issue because ideally if we had like self-regulations of media and media would definitely define who are journalists or not journalists, but I think civil society should make pressure on dark funding or like funding of media, and I can show an example of social media how it is like there is a principle of self-regulation and co-regulation. Self-regulation is demonstrated by Facebook. Facebook has been developing its policies since like 2017 when Cambridge Analytica scandal rose, and now Facebook have updated the community standards. They banned advertisement from abroad in each country where election take place, and now like Facebook following Ukrainian elections and it's a good example how the platform takes responsibility for the action. And compared to VKontakte, Russian social network is fully controlled by Russian government. Our research on Russian segment on VKontakte in Ukrainian elections shows that VKontakte is a platform to share anti-Semitism and hate speech. And it's absolutely not regulated in Russia because Russian government is not interested because it sparks like these discussions. And it's not possible in Facebook, in fact, because this is a tool from Western civilization where there is ban of any hate speech and anti-Semitism. But the issue of self-regulations may violate users' rights because there was like disputes why Facebook banned Ukrainian users and so on. And this means that civil society should jump into the co-regulation, where the voice of civil society will be with the teams of social networks to talk about the common rules, what is accepted and what is not.
Thank you. Let me address to the audience if there are questions. Yes? One question, and second question, third question. Gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Maxim Kyiv from Central European Institute, also previously researcher of the Riga Stratcom Center of Excellence. Good to see here some familiar faces. Mostly from the half-secret chat, which is Freedom Wins.
Yeah.
So good to see you also. Well, honestly, I also try to examine the disinformation issues, but every time I speak about it, I try a bit hard to find something new to speak about in front of the audience. So my respect to you, of course. But still, I prefer not to examine it or not to speak about disinformation, but to fight it. But nevertheless. Well, I like what Gedrius said about about the elves. Also, like another example about probably this YouTube program, which is Держитесь там, with famous Lithuanian journalist who is speaking Russian and who is actually trying to use humor against Russian disinformation. And thank you for your honesty, by the way. I always admire Lithuanians because they always speak honestly. And that's why I would like to ask for honestly for Ukrainian speakers. Elections. So unfortunately now during the recent 2 weeks, I guess we had these billboards or advertisements which are trying to say Dumai, So, which means think or vote with ratio, not with emotions. Голосуй розумом, не емоціями. Don't you think that probably, to some extent, politicians, especially Ukrainian politicians, are kind of responsible for what we have, for not media, not literate people. Probably they are interested in having some kind of loyal voters, a bit silly voters, which do not critically think, which, not to mention, they are not reading political programs at all. So don't you think it's a bit late to call for a ratio? And well, that's why probably we have this circus with analysis, analysis of Zelensky and Poroshenko. That's why we have all this circus, which we had yesterday, 1+1 channel, and so on. What I'm trying to say, the trolls are not always in the forests or in Russia. Sometimes they're even in political parties, in political headquarters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A question there, lady? So we'll collect 3 questions and then I will ask to reply.
Thank you very much. My name is Marina Krulevitz. I'm from Odessa National University. Due to globalization, we have witnessed that such phenomenon as post-truth. And that means that usually people are guided by the emotions, not by the facts. And nowadays, moreover, you don't need to be a journalist or reporter to spread the news. You can just simply go on Facebook, post there everything that you want, and then people will just follow it and they will spread this information. So my question is, what should, for example, the simple ordinary citizen do in such circumstances as we face the post-truth? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And here, the questions here.
My name is Maria, I am a communication expert, and I want to address you the following question. I have been working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Information Policy of Ukraine, and we are, for the last few years, the Ukrainian government is trying to counter Russian propaganda, but all the actions seems to be like beating a dead horse. So what would you recommend for Ukrainian government to do efficient, to increase its information resilience? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So 3 questions. The responsibility of politicians for denying the rationality, what to do to ordinary citizens, and what to do to Ukrainian governments. Alexander, yes.
If I may, I'd like to take the question about post-truth, basically because it struck me personally. I hear this term very often, as I think a lot of us do, but I think that post-truth is essentially what has been talking about today. I think that post-truth world is the world of noise. Is the world of irresponsible journalism or even not journalism. Here is the question of whether we consider social media to be media outlets or we don't consider them to be media outlets. And this world is very chaotic and it leads us as readers, as audience, as viewers to confusion. So the goal of any ordinary citizen who asks himself or herself how to survive in this chaotic world, whatever you like to call it, is to sort out this confusion. And unfortunately, as exciting as this question is, the answer is very boring. I personally believe that media literacy is our only remedy. And of course, this coin has 2 sides. And it demands from any citizen a lot of personal effort and a lot of time and resources, especially psychological resources, if you ask me, to become aware, to understand the core principles of what journalists are responsible, what journalists are reputable, what are the main principles that you can use to detect fake news, or how do you understand that this is not a real story, or that the story has been selected to fit a specific narrative. So all of this demands a lot of personal efforts from any single person, and I think that it's unfair from government and from civil society, and actually dangerous to leave people alone with this effort. So we have to promote media literacy. I know that we have been talking about all the events about media literacy, but we really have to talk about it and keep talking about it until it works. Because I think that there may be other techniques and other methods of survival in this post-truth world, but nothing will be as effective as media literacy.
Thank you. Johan?
Yeah, so here we mentioned three elements, political parties, media, and users. So I'm not worried about media, because I think sooner or later they would figure out what will be the new place for them in this ecosystem. The sooner the better. I'm also not worried about politicians, because they also sooner or later, and it's better later than sooner, figure out how to use the opportunities of all this, and they already actually start to do that. I'm actually worried about the users, because previously they've always been relying on mediator, which used to be media. And media explained to them what it's all about. Why is this candidate is running, who is behind, where his money or her money are coming from, and so on and so forth. So now we see less and less of that, and we see journalism more and more moving into the clickbait segment, tabloid segment, to sell. Journalists are always pushed to sell them. What's the result of to do fact-checking and research and do in-depth journalism and other things? Because every journalist is permanently immersed in kind of routine daily activities, less and less journalists in newsrooms, smaller newsrooms, and more expectations what their output should be. And so basically very few mediation is coming users' way. So one of the answers is to raise their awareness about those problems, empower them to do more fact-checking and basic understanding of anything, because again, previously, if they want to understand, is our economy doing better or worse, they can just read what journalists would tell them, and now probably they need to get the idea of what is GDP, and how it's measured and how it's correlated to their pensions, and other things, and gas prices. So they really need to do more on their own. And then media literacy again. For example, now we are doing a program with IREX for schools. It's for 8th and 9th graders. And I think this would be the best answer to this, because when we are tackling with the results of disinformation, that's sometimes already too late. And of course, I would agree there are some bubbles where we would not be able to penetrate and change someone's views on things. But if we would be explaining to children, who are, by the way, the biggest media consumers today, what the danger might be over there, how good quality journalism is different from any other type of journalism, how they can be journalists by themselves. This would be the answer, and again, Ukraine is not inventing bicycle here. We are following the footsteps of Finland, Sweden, France, and some other countries which already been doing that for quite a long time. So we just need to how we can use their methodologies and try to do that to help people to navigate through that. And that's not only about children. We also need to help to navigate adults. We need to help to navigate journalists very often through all that. Policymakers and all other stakeholders, because very often they sometimes do not understand very, very basic things, how the system is now organized. And when I'm saying organized, I would rather say disorganized, because actually there is no any kind of vertical organization we're accustomed to. It's very horizontal, it's very kind of networking type of the scene, and it works in a very different way with very, very few people understanding the ramifications of that.
Thank you, Johan. Who else? Vitaly?
I want to address the issue of rational choice, if it works. Today we live in the world of opportunities, and it is much more better than years and years ago. The world is open to us, and we can be whoever we want to be. We can do whatever we want to do. And internet and social media is an example. You can create easily video. You can post whatever you want. You can make some collages. You can like somebody's video. But there is the other side of internet, is understanding of its rational parts. Its rational part of social media, of internet, is that it is a marketing force. You leave digital traces, and even if you hide it as an anonymous user, and many people believe they are anonymous on internet, in fact it's not true. You can always be tracked. You can always, like, your identity can be discovered. And this is the issue, that when we doing something emotionally, we can break some laws, or we can harm someone's, I don't know, someone's rights, bullying, and so on. But for everyone, and regarding election and emotional choice, that every citizen, every user, he or she has responsibility, and this responsibility should be articulated much better. Because, for example, like security services of Ukraine arrested like dozens of moderators of separatist groups online, and they accuse them of violation of Ukrainian laws. And I believe that most of these moderators, they don't even know about the existing laws, which say that you shouldn't call for change territorial integrity of Ukraine or constitutional order. For them, online is something as entertainment. And I'm quite optimistic regarding election results, because the results of elections, it's a responsibility of all voters, and whichever candidate will be elected, those who voted for this candidate, they will take responsibility for the country, in fact. And nothing wrong with it. This is how democracy works.
Maxim, don't forget the question about the government.
Yeah, I want to start.
Okay.
Actually, this is a terrific question, because at Atlantic Council, all our initiatives must have practical side to it. So we are in touch with democratic governments, trying to kind of provide them with policy options based on our research. So there are 3 ways how we do it and how we encourage them proceed. First of all, I mean, this is very practical governing thing. Not a single governing policy should be based on disinformation or information that is faulty. That's why inside the government we encourage to create an infrastructure that analyzes but also debunks information on a regular basis. And it's spread across, not concentrated in just one agency, but spread across every department that deals with gathering analysis that will be a base for governing policy. The second of all is understand and map networks that produce very dangerous or amplify dangerous disinformation tactics. Should be done together with civil society. And for example, DFRL Lab, which is Atlantic Council project, is now the biggest success when it comes to civil society organizing digital forensic operations, and then going to social networks and helping them to close those networks down, mapping them, and also providing them with information. Because, you know, let's not be naive or vilify social networks so much. Their business models are thrive on engagement and number of users. At the same time, they don't have enough kind of resources to spend all their time mapping those malicious networks. That's how we help them to do that, and they're doing terrific. Some networks been doing terrific progress in that. And third one is for government understanding and mapping public frustrations. Addressing them is also kind of a long-term tactic, but it's still very useful, because there is a correlation between those audiences that will be affected by disinformation and have very high levels of dissatisfaction with specific policies, like anti-corruption and so on and so on. But ending on and addressing the question, addressing the first question about the voters in general, about Ukrainian voters, I have probably am the most satisfied with Ukrainian voters at the moment, because I don't think that they can do I don't think that they can make some naive or misguided choices, because we're talking about Ukraine after the Maidan revolution. Those are the same voters who did the revolution. Those are the same voters that were the first responders to Russian invasion of the East. those are the same voters that rally now around the election process, and we've seen the record numbers of voters standing in lines to vote and control the quality of the electoral process. I don't necessarily think that voting by guiding through emotion is something horribly wrong, and if you look into studies of political science, the majority of vote is not logical. At the same time, there is a big difference between voting emotionally and voting emotionally guiding by right virtue. And I think Ukrainians are fine with that. And their priorities as the most optimistic country in Europe, as the country that actually their citizens sacrifice their lives for European ideals, I think the virtue is there. So I don't have any troubles with trusting their decision and how they lead it at this point.
Thank you. Gedrus?
I have great privilege not to be politically correct. Please let me use it. The question concerning government, I think, sorry for my French, the biggest problem was shitty strategic communication. I think in the last 5 years in Ukraine happened 1,000 beautiful things, but it was not communicated enough. Like, for example, in Ukraine, when the last 5 years it was introduced 1,000 new law, which goes according to European Union and so on. But who knows about it? If you're reading, they just corruption. But it was done once again. A lot of beautiful things. It's needed to communicate that, and that's it. And we need more. We need more positive news, but not self-beating.
Thank you very much. Maybe some more questions? Yes, Natalia, some others? Oksana?
Maybe not a question, but a comment. I think if we were really to address the elephant in the room, and I was hoping, Volodymyr, that pursuing yesterday's day of a little bit of a warm bath of discussions that we had yesterday, we would pick on that today. First of all, post-truth world. I mean, really, post-truth is just the world where a lot of people tell a lot of lies. But now with the help of the media, they are just getting to us faster and more. On the issue of why, and I fully agree with you, there were a lot of problems with the strategic communications, but inside Ukraine, why there were so many Ukrainians who were convinced that the country is not on the right path and it's actually failing and it's becoming poorer, is because we do not really have freedom of expression or freedom of speech in Ukraine. We have an illusion of that. We have a pluralism of TV channels, still very much heavily influencing the point of view of the Ukrainian voters, as we could tell from the first round of the Ukrainian elections. And it's not really freedom of speech or freedom of expression. It's an illusion of it. And unless we really address that issue, and unless we really address the funding of the oligarchs who stand behind it, always there are very different agendas, and not necessarily coinciding with the topic of this conference. Because the topic of this conference is the security forum in Kyiv, and presumably it's about the security of Ukraine. Well, not necessarily in all of the oligarchs' interest is the security of Ukraine long term, and how they have influenced the society in the last 5 years. I think there's a lot of responsibility. And then maybe just on the issue of media literacy is not enough. I think in Ukraine we really need to impose the education from as early age as possible of civics, of how democracy works, because to a lot of citizens, it's still a mystery. They do already know how to come to elections and vote and cast a ballot, but that does not really mean that they understand the whole cause and effect of, of truly how democracy works and of their roles and responsibilities in it. And that is why we can wake up in a country in which there could be a candidate that will win the election during the war, but at the same time, there will be part of the population. We need to go back also to the identity of the people, because at the same time, we haven't talked in this forum enough about not just whether people stood in Maidan or how they're voting, but also about their relation to and their understanding of Russia today. If we talk about the security, the people who are voting today, what do they think of Russia? Do they name Russia an enemy? Elves understand that they fight against the enemy, and the name of the enemy is Russia. Do majority of the Ukrainian voters understand that Russia is an enemy? That is a big question, which should be addressed by all of the people who work in government, in Mininform or MFA, or on the side of the civic society, because we're waking up in a very different country vis-a-vis the efforts we thought we were all producing. Thank you.
Thank you. Oksana?
Thank you. I would like to address the question of offensive, the best defense. Is it affordable for Ukraine as a strategy? Because, as it was mentioned today, the debunking of information and just media literacy is not effective nowadays. So, to what extent is that moral, and whether we can afford it today? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have two questions, and I will ask for very brief replies because we have only 4 minutes left.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Natalia that we always need to come back to the issue of the security, because Ukraine is in the state of the war. And again, when I'm talking to many journalists, both inside of Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, they try to persuade me in the opposite and saying that, you know, that was invented by Poroshenko to promote his electoral campaign, and if you agree with that, you are Porokobot, you know. So that basically brings the whole kind of pyramid of priorities flopping down, you know, and persuading me that that war is actually invented by, in my mind, you know, and I do not perceive the things as they really are. And that's exactly the impression what many Ukrainians receive, and that's why they behave in the way they behave, because they don't feel any threat to their existence, and they don't care about physical existence of their countries. Because any rational person, if they would have the enemy trying to eliminate your country, would definitely mobilize and try to sort out collectively what would be the best line of defense or offense, as you said. But we don't see any of that. And in terms of if Ukraine need to go offensive, that's really a very big question, especially now, because previously I would be probably more open giving advice to government how they might regulate things and doing other things. But because of the new kind of political reality we are waking up to, I would think twice before subscribing to governmental idea to regulate internet here and now. But in general, of course, it's up to every sovereign state to regulate what is happening in their information sovereign state. So if they would regulate that, they would control that space, they would decide what is legit and what is not, that would protect their citizens, and that's the duty of any government to protect their citizens, primarily, especially in the Ukrainian case.
Thank you. Someone else? Offense against defense? Okay, yeah, Vitaly.
I just want to mention one of the results of the recent poll is probably from Democratic Initiative, is that 52% of Ukrainians wants to improve relations with Russia. That's very noticeable. To understand what is general public think, and when we talk about, like, I would disagree with Maxim about how Ukrainians advise and that Ukrainian citizens like brought revolution of dignity. That's true, but we always had that the minority of Ukrainians, the most active part of Ukrainians, sacrificed their life, and they were the agents of change. We should work to increase the number of people who see themselves as agents of change, who take their personal responsibility, because I do believe that Ukrainians, many of them are childish. They still believe that government owes them something, government should protect them, they should get them salary and so on. And this is very basic discussion. And it is a discussion in a poor country. That is the main. It's only possible in a poor country where people still rely on subsidies, on responsibility from someone else, but not their own responsibility.
Thank you very much. We passed from information to very broad issues, and it's a very broad discussion. Gedrius Sakalauskas, Alexander Tsekhanovska, Yevhen Fechenko, Maxim Aristavi, Vitaly Moroz. This is UkraineWorld and Internews Ukraine, and I advise you to read this paper, Taming the Hydra. It's behind me. Basically, there are also responses what the government should do, and the paper on contact. Thank you very much. Thank you.